Welcome to session 3 of our 4-part series on emerging from challenging times with strength and resilience. Tonight's session is on tough stuff. So let's get to it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back for part 3 of this 4-part series. We've already had a couple of presentations, which I hope felt helpful. So the first one is about setting intentions that work. So as we come into a new phase of life or whatever's happening with this pandemic, how do we orient so that we become the best versions of ourselves and we're most capable to do so? The last presentation, we talked about resiliency and post-traumatic growth. This has been a very difficult time and everybody has had their own brand of pandemic struggle. So it's important to understand how to maximize growth and resiliency rather than getting stuck. Today, we're going to talk about things that get us stuck. So this tough stuff. I'm definitely going to touch on sleep because this is one of our patterns, as we talked about in the previous presentations, our biggest biorhythm that can easily get disrupted when our habits and our schedules and our norm gets disrupted. And when it starts to get messed up, it creates a really tricky cycle that as psychologists, we know how to flip. So with cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm going to give you some of the tidbits around that. We're also going to talk about habits, these patterns that we get stuck in, why and what to do. And we're going to close it all down with how to manage guilt. If you're human and alive, things haunt us from the past. So the smarter we can get about guilt so that we're not carrying it, the better. So let's get into it. As you guys know, I'm Dr. Lindsay Bira, clinical health psychologist and adjunct assistant professor of psychiatry at UT Health. I have my own private practice, and I'm very passionate about doing speaking around emotional wellness and emotional intelligence. This is really our mission here on earth, is to become the highest version of ourselves and to get smarter than our brains. So that's what we're here to do. Now, if you remember, this is kind of what we talk about all the time. Life in general is a bit of a struggle. We are not supposed to just achieve happiness. In fact, that's impossible. Happiness happens to us randomly. We can enjoy it, but then it will float away and something else will come in its place. Life is a struggle. That's just kind of the natural, realistic norm. And the pandemic has brought another layer of struggle that's made that a little bit heavier. But even a pandemic is just part of being human and being alive. It will come every once in a while, and here we are in it, and another one will happen again at some point in the future. This is just how things work biologically. So it's definitely brought some heaviness into our life and things that we've had to navigate. Now, what we want to focus on is moving through this natural life struggle well, and also getting rid of this layer. So this is the layer that we have some control over, at least some more control. So what we're going to be talking about today is these things that add some of the weight, which are sleep issues, guilt, anxiety that's hanging around, and bad habits that might keep us stuck. If you remember, what I love to talk about is that our brain is tricky. If you're human and alive, your brain is playing tricks on you all the time. Our job is to become aware of those tricks so that we have more control over our perception and our movement through the world. Just like these optical illusions show us, we perceive movement when we're looking around the screen. We as adults know that the movement is not there, so we're smarter than our brains whenever we look at this. But even though we know that it's not there, we cannot turn it off. We will always see that movement because those processes that make us perceive that are just so deeply embedded, we can't think beyond them to change our perception. Our emotions and our stress responses are the exact same way. These things will happen to us, and if we don't get smarter than them, then they will just drive us or we will believe in them. So what emotional intelligence is about watching them happen without getting hooked into them and then choosing the appropriate response. If we define emotional intelligence, like we've talked about before, we're here to simply get better at noticing, labeling, and monitoring what we're feeling, doing that same thing with other people, and using this information to appropriately and accurately and helpfully guide our thinking and behavior so that we are able to move towards that highest version of ourselves and not get stuck. So when we think about this, I always like to address sleep. Sleep is an interesting process because it happens to us. It is largely outside of our control. And it's one of those processes that if we're having some trouble with it, the harder we try to fix it or to get it, the more it is out of our reach, right? I know everybody's had that experience where you've gone through some sleep issues. It's actually statistically very likely to experience insomnia in one given year. So, most people will experience a bout of insomnia. What we don't want to happen is for that insomnia to trigger anxiety that then triggers behaviors that actually come back around and reinforce the sleep issues. That's what we see in insomnia. And that's why one of the best approaches to treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So if anybody feels like that they're very hooked into that process, that's what you would search for, is a psychologist or a therapist who's been trained in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. We also now know that another layer of an acceptance-based approach, which is what we call third wave CBT, is very good to integrate in that. And I'm going to be leaving you guys with a great resource at the end of this presentation. So, what is sleep? Sleep is a neurobiological process that involves many different areas of the brain and other processes, but specifically it boils down to our circadian rhythm and our sleep drive. Both of these physiological processes are driven by chemicals, and these chemicals are released based on certain patterns and rhythms that we have throughout the day. That's why if our schedule gets disrupted, our norm gets disrupted, we have a big change, or sometimes just randomly, these chemicals can get off and then we experience difficulty sleeping. Sleep issues can come one of three types. We can have early sleep issues, so we're having difficulty falling asleep. We can have middle sleep issues, which is difficulty staying asleep in the middle of the night, so you're waking up randomly and having difficulty getting back to sleep. We can also have late sleep issues, which means you're waking up much earlier than planned and can't get back to sleep, and that's a frustrating experience. So that's usually how people experience sleep issues. Sometimes it's all three happening together. Sometimes people just have one, and sometimes you might notice a pattern that you've had throughout your life. So maybe it's just something that your brain and body do that make it a little bit difficult to sleep. So sleep, like we talked about, is very based on behavioral cues and conditioning or training. When we talk about behavioral conditioning in psychology and neuroscience, we're really talking about one thing happening that triggers a response, and that happening consistently over time triggers our body to have a certain response. This gets back to Pavlov's dogs. If you remember that Keystone study where the dogs, of course, salivate in response to food, but then when a bell was being paired with the food, the dog's brain learned to just salivate automatically in response to the bell, even when there's no food present. This is how our brain starts to make connections. So if we think about how this relates to sleep, we have our bedroom and our bed. Whenever we lay down, if our brain has learned to get sleepy and have good sleep in bed, then our brain quickly starts to release all the chemicals that we need. It starts to slow our heart rate, slow our blood pressure, lower our body temperature, all of those processes to where we slide into sleep more easily. We don't even think about it. We wake up in the morning and say, oh my gosh, I went to sleep and I got great sleep last night. I didn't even realize it. Kind of just happened to me, right? Now, when sleep issues are happening, the same is true, but in a negative cycle way. So if I'm laying in bed and not able to sleep, and I'm getting frustrated, which is increasing my heart rate, increasing my blood pressure, increasing my body temperature. And I'm getting frustrated and starting to make assumptions. If I don't get sleep, then my day tomorrow is going to be really difficult. Or if I'm not getting consistent sleep, this is going to affect my health in the long term. Hear all these kind of catastrophic thoughts. They make sense. It's somewhat logical thinking, but it's just not helpful, right? So now what happens is we're laying in bed, having our body respond to these kinds of things, and we're training ourselves to have an increased heart rate in response to the cue of our bedroom and bed. So this happens very easily. This is a lot of times why when people are having sleep issues, they say, I don't know what it is. I can sleep perfectly on the couch. I go to sleep so easily, or at a hotel or at somebody else's house, another room. But the moment that I go into my bedroom, it's like I'm wide awake. That is Pavlov's conditioning right there. So it's those kinds of cycles that we want to intervene in. And I'm going to leave you guys with this resource that we're going to kind of go through behaviorally in just a second. And of course, we know that stress and emotions definitely affect our sleep cycles and pretty much all of our cycles. So the better we can be at understanding the stress and getting smarter than emotions and have those tools, then the less we're allowing ourselves to get stuck in these cycles that condition us for problems that really feel outside of our control. So this is the first handout. This is based on cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. These are some tips, or what we call kind of sleep hygiene rules, that will help train your brain, no matter who you are, no matter if you have sleep issues right now or not. You can read through this to make sure you're doing everything that you can. If you don't have any sleep issues, then it doesn't make sense to really do anything different, but you can keep this on hand in case you do at some point, or if somebody in your life is starting to complain about sleep issues, this is a great resource to hand to them. So let's look at these really quickly. So 1, never use the bedroom for anything but sleep or sex. So the moment that we start to read, watch TV, exercise, eat, look at our phone, we're starting to cue our brain for wakefulness in bed. Also, never look at the clock during the middle of the night. Just set your alarm and trust it. If we look at the time, what starts happening? We start to worry, catastrophize, or do math about how many hours of sleep you have left. And all of that just reduces the chance you're going to go to sleep and causes a stress response. So it's just not good. We want to radically accept that we've just set the alarm and kind of just be curious about being up at night. Lie down to go to sleep only when you feel sleepy. Otherwise, just stay out of the bedroom, especially if you've been having sleep issues. This is wise to do, even if that means you're going to be up all night. It's still not training your brain to be awake in bed, right? So it's still a step forward. Sometimes we got to get backwards and opposite before we hack the cycle. If you are in bed but unable to go to sleep within 15 or 20 minutes, this is very important. Get up and go to another room. Just kind of sit in dim light, read something boring, or organize the silverware drawer. Stay up until you feel sleepy and then return to bed. So when you start to get that nodding off feeling, and if you can't sleep, repeat it. And even if it lasts all night, again, it's kind of like the opposite, right? It's not ideal, but it's going to help build a sleep load so that you can get more consistent sleep over time. We want to set the alarm to go off at the same day, bedtimes the same day. Do some diaphragmatic breathing. So that's where we breathe in slowly with our belly and then really spend time on the exhale, making the exhale twice as long as the inhale. If you do this while you're laying in bed, you greatly increase the chance that you're lowering your heart rate, lowering your blood pressure, and allowing your body temperature to drop and kind of cueing your brain to slide into sleep. That's a great training thing to do if you are laying awake in bed. There's some other things in here about lights as soon as you get up. Naps, definitely not recommended because we're just kind of getting rid of sleep load that we could use for later in the night. Exercising, keeping your room cold, showering 30 minutes before bed. So it makes our body temperature go up and then we get a natural decrease, which cues everything physiologically for sleep. Quite a few of other ones on here. And you can see at the end, practice radical acceptance. So we need to say to ourselves, I don't know what time it is, but if I'm up, I'm just going to go with it. I don't know why I can't sleep, but that's okay. Just going to notice what it's like to be up at night. And if my brain's doing this thing for a couple of weeks, that's fine. There's going to be no negative effect. So I'm just going to let it happen. So that's radical acceptance, which we're going to come back to. You guys, I know I gave you this handout, the first one and the second one. Here it is again, because this is woven into absolutely everything. It is such an important concept to understand and skill to step into. This is some of the pillars. Radical acceptance and gentle curiosity are pillars that support the practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness has become, a real big buzzword these days. And I think, it kind of turns some people off or, creates some confusion around what it is. That's why I love to talk about radical acceptance and gentle curiosity. These are actually these skills that we can hold on to and practice from a cognitive perspective and behaviorally that train our brain to respond better over time. And this is research-based acceptance and commitment therapy kind of stuff. That's another term I've been throwing in here. So it's a great kind of therapy to look into. Now, when we look at bad habits, and this is a very general topic, so you can just kind of reflect what this might be for you. And again, no judgment. Why do we have bad habits? Because we're human and alive, and we have a brain that trips us up. That's it. So we can just kind of observe it with no judgment and then be interested in how we might make some movement around it. Bad habits are essentially behaviors that our brain uses to avoid distress. These can be very mindless. We might not be aware of them at all, or they can feel uncontrollable. So they're kind of just happening to us. And kind of the bottom line is they might make us feel better in the moment because we're avoiding the distress that we could feel if we don't do them, or we're avoiding the distress of just pushing against them. Again, we hate distress. Our brain hates distress. So anything we can do to avoid it in the moment sounds like the better option. But the thing is it makes us feel worse over time. And this can be, it just has a bad effect on us over time, or we just feel bad that we haven't been able to break it over time. It's just not good to carry. So different types of bad habits to kind of reflect on, and we could add more to this list. So you might think of something that's not mentioned. Body-focused repetitive behaviors. This is something that we measure in research. This is something like nail picking, skin picking, hair touching, hair grooming, scratching, or even leg shaking. So as I say that, let's all observe we were doing something like that right now, moving in our chair back and forth, leg shaking, whatever that might be. Just kind of observe if that was something that you were doing as you were tuning in. This is our nervous system trying to basically ground and have a sense of control and calmness. This is a sad example, but if you go to the zoo, oftentimes we will see animals rubbing their head on something, rubbing their head, even so much that they will break the skin and bleed. This is a perfect example of a body-focused repetitive behavior. Their nervous system might be bored or experiencing some type of distress. And so that's how they're getting other sensation or other stimuli to move away from that distress. Dogs do this whenever they're in pain. Maybe they're having, some arthritis, and they just repetitively lick their paws. That's a sign that a dog is in pain. And that's why. It's a body-focused repetitive behavior that the nervous system is driving. We as humans, we can understand that and get smarter than it, right? So just think about for you what that might be playing out in the background. And then we want to stop it and see what that feels like. That's going to be hard. But we're going to talk about some emotions that brings up in a second. Substance use. Of course, this is a bad habit that we know. This can be something as small as coffee or as large as heroin, right? So substances come in many different forms, many different intensities and danger levels, but it is using substance to avoid something. Now, we don't want to label anything as wrong. Drinking daily cups of coffee doesn't have to be something that you change, but it's good to kind of observe the habit and question it. What good is it bringing me versus negative? And can I break this just to kind of show myself that I can readjust and control some things and everything? Not a have to, but something to observe. More intense substances, nicotine, alcohol, those, if they're being used consistently, absolutely has a long-term negative effect. So that's something that we can tap into from a values-based perspective that might give us the strength to push back against it. That gets very difficult though. Nicotine is a harder substance chemically and behaviorally to break than something like heroin. This is very hard, and there's many reasons why. So if you are looking for support in that, look for a therapist who's been trained in smoking cessation or nicotine cessation. We have vapes now and all kinds of stuff. Definitely something to get support around. Food is another bad habit. We quickly feel better when we have salt, sugar, and fats. It's just how it is. It's how our brain is made. So if we have bad habits around that, we can really get some bad outcomes and feel bad about it over time. Procrastination. I like to say that procrastination is not a time management issue. It's actually an emotion management issue. When you see the sink full of dishes and it's the last thing that you want to do in the moment, what are we doing? We're avoiding the distress of having to do the dishes by putting them off. We have the time. We know how to manage time, but we don't want to feel the negative feeling, so we avoid. Something good to reflect on: procrastination. Emotional reactivity. Sometimes we have habits of being irritable. Maybe we're lacking some self-care behaviors, diet, exercise, relaxation, whatever that might be for you. That can be a bad habit of not doing it. Sedentary activity can be a bad habit. And of course, avoidance. Anything that we're doing to avoid something that might be hard to approach might be a bad habit. Avoidance-based coping is just a bad habit in general. It's just a very wide term. So good things to reflect on. Habits allow immediate discomfort, but long-term loss. Usually they're based on avoidance of distress, and the experience of guilt and shame can start a cycle, and it can maintain the cycle, because then we just feel bad that we haven't broken the habit yet. So the goal here with habits is really taking the responsibility of being better, understanding the consequences of a habit, getting smarter than our brain to break the cycle, tapping into values and intentions to have the strength to make the change. See presentation number 1 of this 4-part series. That would help kind of define that further, and then work through any guilt or shame that might keep this cycle alive. Guilt and shame drives avoidance. These are very hard emotions to feel, so we tend to avoid them, or avoid memories that might bring those up, or avoid situations that might trigger it in us. So it's good to know what to do with guilt and shame. That brings us to this category: guilt, shame, regret. What do we do with it? So this ends up being something that it comes from maybe a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So it's an emotional reaction to something that happened. But if there's not something that we can do about it pretty immediately, like issue an apology or orient to be better, then it's pointless. We do not need to be carrying this. This only gets us very, very deep and in downward negative cycles. So if we experience it for longer than maybe a couple hours or a couple days, then it's not ours to carry. So let's dig into that. When we talk about this, there's this sheet is from a module in cognitive processing therapy for PTSD. This is an evidence-based therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, regardless of trauma type: combat trauma, accident, sexual assault, childhood abuse. Doesn't matter the type of trauma. This is a wonderful and very effective treatment that has major effectiveness, 6 to 10 sessions. And most people are below clinical threshold for diagnosis. Even if somebody doesn't have the diagnosis of PTSD, this is great for sifting through emotions and gaining skills. So this is made by Dr. Patricia Resick, and you can see my notes on here. So anything that happens to us, an event, we want to examine what are the facts so that we can appropriately identify our role. The first level here is something that's unforeseeable. This is just an accident, part of the reality of being alive. There's no way that we could predict it would happen. A higher entity didn't part the clouds and say, hey, watch out for this later. We just did not know, right? So when something bad happens and we experience it, the only appropriate emotion is grief and sadness. However, our brain tends to look for something that we can control, like it was my fault or it was somebody else's fault, and we make that too heavy because there's something about that that feels a little bit better. The next level up is responsibility. So maybe we neglected a responsibility in something. We played a role in this event, but we did not intend the outcome. Therefore, we might regret it, like, oh, I kind of knew better, or I should have been more aware of this. But we can't beat ourselves up too much, because with responsibility, we have so many responsibilities at one time that we can't possibly orient to the most important one at all times. And when we pick up one responsibility, we have to put down another. And when we do that, sometimes something bad can happen over here. So we also have to give ourselves, a lot of leeway about why we may have neglected a responsibility. We also have to share responsibility. If we're taking responsibility for something, who else or what else was involved in the scenario that we can break down into a pie chart? If I had 30% of the responsibility, I have to give responsibility to other people who were involved. The last category is the only place where fault, blame, and guilt apply. That's when somebody intended the harm and intended the outcome. So if you did not intend the bad thing to happen, then the fault, blame, and guilt is not yours. If you did, you really wanted somebody to suffer or hurt, okay, congrats, you're human through some growth phases, okay? We all react like that sometimes. Then we can take that responsibility, issue an apology, and commit to new ways of being. So long-term guilt, fault, blame is still not ours. Does that make sense? I could spend an hour breaking this down with multiple examples. And, I love to work with people on this and kind of make it more personal. So this is a little bit kind of glossy and moving through it quickly, but just kind of notice what it brings up for you. And if you do want to work through it more with somebody, if you feel like that would be helpful, look for a provider who's trained in cognitive processing therapy for PTSD, but it doesn't have to be PTSD related. Okay. My job here is to give some information that might be helpful and then provide a little bit of a roadmap. Okay. This brings us to this that I've created, and I often talk about with my clients. This is a great thing to reflect on, but it looks a little meaty, a lot of words here, right? So let's break it down. What we're looking at here is, in one situation, we want to examine what is our interpretation, okay? And what we need to be careful of. And so anything that happens in your life, you can do this reflection exercise and then focus on moving up. So what is the interpretation? What does it sound like? So these thoughts that we give to ourselves, and then what does it feel like? So let's look at this bottom level. If something bad happens or something difficult happens, or I'm struggling in some way, and I'm interpreting it, the reason for my struggle or reason for this bad thing is my personal brokenness. So of course these things happen to me because it's me, or of course I'm not able to do this thing because I'm not adequate, right? These kinds of thoughts sound like those that I just gave, or I am broken, damaged, or less than. I have always been broken, damaged, or less than. I will always be broken, damaged, or less than. And I am just different or isolated or disconnected from other people as a function of my brokenness. Do you feel that hole that we just sunk into? The only thing that comes out of that is guilt, shame, anger, resentment, anxiety, and perfectionism and judgment, which are bad habits. Does that make sense? We can all see patterns of that in ourselves, and maybe certain situations that bring us to that. Or maybe when you were younger, you might have gone there more so, or it can go the opposite way too. When you were younger, you had no problem with that. Maybe being older, kind of slip into this. There's no right or wrong or predictable pattern here. It just depends on reflection, what that might be for you. We want to stay away from this category. This is never, ever, 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 ever helpful. And it only drives something like depression. It really sets the stage for that. Now, this next level up is a really healthy place to be. This is taking responsibility. So you're not going as kind of deep and broken and hopeless and helpless with it. We're saying, all right, so maybe I have a difficulty or an issue, or there's something about me that is not serving me well, but I can just take the responsibility for that and enact an action that would lead me towards growth. So this is very values-based. This gets back to what we were talking about in that first presentation on intention and values. So what this sounds like is, I value being certain ways. I value doing certain things. I value treating people in certain ways, and I value having certain things. Therefore, if I value that, I'm going to look for the action that will move me back towards that thing. So even if I mess up and cuss out somebody or say hurtful things, and then I feel a little bit guilty about it, I can say, okay, I'm going to take responsibility for that. That's not who I want to be. Even if that person made horrible decisions and treated me very poorly, I still don't want to act in those ways. So I'm going to take that responsibility and commit to moving forward better, right? This leads to awareness, intention. We might have some regret that haunts us a little bit, but overall, we get to be realigned. We get the chance to realign with our values and grow moving forward. It's such a great place to be. Now, the next category here is where we're getting into radical acceptance. Again, I will always weave this in because it's so helpful. So an event happens and we interpret it. We can say, okay, well, statistically, this happened to me because this is just my experience as an individual human in this world. So this sounds like, genetically, this is my struggle. It's based on where I'm from, how I was raised. It's just my struggle. This is based on my society. That's why this is my struggle. This is based on my life's aspects in some ways. That's why this is my struggle. Okay. It's not overly putting the blame on yourself, other people, society, the world in which we were born at all. It's saying, oh, this is just the reality and it's a little bit specific to me, but I accept it as that reality and I'm committed to maximizing whatever it is moving forward. This leads us to some acceptance, understanding, awareness, of course, frustration and sadness, but that's a normal part of having to look at a reality that's causing us some distress. But we're not getting overly angry. We're not getting stuck in guilt, shame, anger, resentment, perfectionism, holding other people to standards that don't actually exist. Makes sense? That's radical acceptance. Oops. Oh yeah, right. Just another reminder. Radical acceptance. You have this handout. Okay. We're accepting statistical realities. Doesn't mean we have to like it. Doesn't mean we condone it. Doesn't mean we want it. We're just saying it exists and I'm here for it. So what can I do to maximize my trajectory? Gentle curiosity applies here too. Now we get up to the next category where again, we're practicing radical acceptance here. Maybe this is just statistically a human experience. This is how we're interpreting an event. So we say statistically, humans go through this. If I'm human and alive, well, this may happen. So I'm here for it. Other people have experienced this too, because this is a human experience. This is very helpful. We have acceptance, understanding, willingness, connection with other people. We can have some sadness because, it's not fun. We can grieve and have sadness and experience that and be there for it because that's very human, but we're not fighting against it. We're not getting angry. We're not overly blaming ourselves or other people. We're not, making something so heavy that it traps us into this bottom category where we just feel all of these emotions that keep us stuck. Does that make sense? Now, the top category, and I'm not saying that anybody has to have this or it's like the ultimate goal, but just one step above that would be spiritual meaning that some people make. So this sounds like whatever happens, there's a greater purpose and plan, and I trust in that. This really leads to peace, acceptance, trust, meaning, purpose, willingness, and connection. This is why we show in the research that a spiritual approach to things is helpful for people, but it doesn't have to exist. So if you're a person who doesn't really see the value in that, no problem. It's not like we're trying to get to that top category. These are just helpful levels that we have to move through in order to not get stuck and to have that growth trajectory. Okay. And the reason why I have that little starburst around my personal responsibility is because we need that one. If we don't have that one, we get into tricky territory. So if we have a habit of staying in the bottom one, this is depression. There's just no point to it. We need to move out of that as quickly as we can. It's a human process to go to that bottom category, but here's where emotional intelligence kicks in. If we notice that we do, and we notice that's our pattern, we can quickly pull ourselves up to these other levels, right? Now, this personal responsibility, this is where if we stay in this, we will experience growth no matter what. And up here, we have a lot of acceptance and well-being, but here's the thing. We can only experience that acceptance, well-being if we're spending time in that personal responsibility category. Because if we're not, then all we're getting is glossy positivity and avoidance. We're actually losing touch with the vulnerability and the human perspective. So these things kind of sound like somebody who's just like so woke that they can't attach to a struggle, right? Or I know that's a very kind of pop term. So, this might sound like somebody gets diagnosed with cancer, right? And somebody might say, well, just believe that there's a higher purpose, right? Or everything's going to be fine. Just look at the positive. That's not helpful. This is where we get glossy positivity, toxic positivity, and just kind of avoidance of the distress. This is why we anchor in that personal responsibility category, which allows us to float to the others, but we always want to anchor into something, okay? There's ways that we could expand on that, but that's what we have for today. So you have this in a handout. So take a picture of it with your phone, just print it out, put it by your bed or your desk so you can always reflect. This would be a perfect daily exercise to reflect. What did you do yesterday? What are you doing right now? Where are you floating in? And how can we reorient to these other levels? I hope this sounded helpful for everyone. We've got a couple of quick resources. If sleep is a struggle for you, this is a wonderful book. It's based on cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and acceptance and commitment therapy. You can see that top line right there, right? Sleep problems using CBT and ACT. It's a perfect combo. Written by somebody who's board certified psychologist. Awesome. So this is a great resource to keep on hand for yourself or others. We also have another book written by a great psychologist, Emotional First Aid. So if you struggle with things like failure, rejection, guilt, these things that really pull you down in that bottom category, this would be a great book to read and kind of dig further to get some tools in that. So thank you as always for tuning in. Thank you to Mind Science Foundation for hosting this. We're now going to move into the question and answer portion. So please get your questions ready. I look forward to thinking it through with you. Thanks so much.
Hi. Well, that was wonderful. I felt, as you and I were recording these about a couple months ago, I really felt like that triangle or that pyramid was really where everything for me hit home. And I know, and you mentioned this, that I can definitely float up and down, but I love that you said that we should base ourselves in that personal responsibility layer.
Yes, absolutely. That's where we have the most control and can make the most movement quickly. The other ones higher up lead to some acceptance, but if we're really trying to create something or solve a problem, the personal responsibility category is so important.
Super. Okay. And I know that when I was recording this with you and taking it all in, it was a lot to process. And so I see that we don't have any questions or chat, which is fine because we can radically accept that.
Yeah, we go with it.
I see one here. Okay. Okay. Can you give an example? An example of what? Of someone using this pyramid? Super.
Okay, absolutely. I don't know if you have any specific example, like what kind of context or situation, feel free to send that through. We're monitoring this. We'll see it pop up. But basically, let's use a, job rejection or somebody doesn't get a promotion, right? If we assume, so like the bottom category would be the guilt and shame land, right? So I didn't get this because I'm not good enough, or, I was never good enough. I just, I'm not good at these things and they're seeing that and therefore I'm not getting it, right? This is something that I've dealt with because of my brokenness, right? That seems a little bit dramatic to just describe it quickly like that, but I think we can all relate to kind of some form of rejection. We can even layer that onto like a dating example. So for anybody who's dating or has dated, you can kind of reflect back and kind of think about those times where there's been rejection and that the brain quickly goes in that bottom category. Not helpful, ever, 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 right? Our brain will do that sometimes, but then we have to catch it. That's where we have to get smarter than our own brain. I love that statement because that's really what we're here for. So then if we go up into personal responsibility, so this is where, if we use the job example, we say, okay, well, I didn't get it, but what can I do to maximize the chances that that could happen to me in the future? Work really hard, communicate my desire and my disappointment that I didn't get a raise, maybe apply elsewhere. So at the very least, I have some leverage, right? The next time that I ask. So those are the kinds of things that we would put in action that we have immediate control over. The next levels up are, okay, this is something about my own personal struggle. So maybe we are aware that we, lack some communication skills or something that tends to hold us back professionally. That's something that we can say, okay, this is something that I just personally struggle with, or I don't know, getting to work on time or sleep issues or something. This is a struggle that I bring to the table. I can accept that, but I can fall back into the personal responsibility category to maximize the outcome and get things moving. From a higher level, if we go up to and I actually changed that category name to existential meaning, because it doesn't have to be spiritual. Existential is more of like, what is the point of life and the struggle of life, right? So then with that, then we can kind of say, okay, this is supposed to be hard, or I can trust that there might be another time, a bigger plan, or something's going to happen that will go my way as long as I kind of stay here and stick with it. So that's an example from a job perspective, if that helps.
Super. Okay. If a child is experiencing insomnia when going to sleep, how do we avoid a now new procrastination habit because they also want to stay with the parent? You mentioned not staying in the bed so as not to reinforce the original bad habit of stress.
So kids are a little bit different. And I'm going to be totally honest, I do not have training in pediatric psychology. So I would be very curious what my more specialized colleagues would say with children issues. But basically, from what I know, is because kids are different, this doesn't necessarily apply to them. So sometimes the suggestion is to, allow them to be upset in the room, and eventually they tire themselves out and go to sleep. I don't know what the latest recommendation on parenting is necessarily, but I would consult a professional on that, because it can be different strategies with kids. I think sleep training, so that's a word that's used with kids and trying to get them to sleep in their bed and understand, the sleep is not scary or whatever's going on. So sleep training skills for kids would be important. Also, it sounds like there's some anxiety that's developed there around sleep and around leaving parents. It's interesting when I talk to adults who have had anxiety for a long time, and I ask them, when do you first remember anxiety popping up? A lot of people say when they were a kid alone in their room at night, worrying that their parents were going to die. That's kind of a classic early presentation of anxiety, or the intruders were to come in the home, right? Kind of these things that kids hear about that play on their mind and make bedtime scary. A lot of times they won't talk about that though, so that it's too scary for them to talk about that. So they just don't say that's happening. If they meet with a professional though, who knows the right questions to ask, that can be uncovered. So it might be that there's an underlying anxiety issue that could be targeted, and sleep won't be as difficult.
Super. So going back to sleep and insomnia, is there a blend between, the anxiety and the bad sleep hygiene, but also is there ever a chemical or biological issue that causes insomnia, like somebody's circadian rhythm is like genetically off?
Yes, absolutely. And so genetically, people have a different need for sleep, amount of sleep, and kind of time for bedtime and all that. So there's a difference there. There can also be just kind of chemical imbalance. And there's also a neurological component as well, especially if somebody's had a head injury. So this can be a concussion. We're now categorizing concussions as traumatic brain injuries, because sometimes they just have more effects than we realize they do. So if anybody's had a head injury, then that can affect sleep as well. I would say, because there's no real solution to that, to those kinds of sleep issues, getting really good about the behavioral piece and making sure you have that ironed out, you're maximizing your sleep. And then if there is that kind of organic issue that keeps happening, we just have to practice kind of radical acceptance. So this is just what my brain does. I tend to be up at night. I can roll with it and not worry about it, because the moment we start getting anxiety about it, it just kind of snowballs. There's also, I can't remember if I mentioned this at the end, but there's the Muse headband that I highly recommend. And they made one for sleep now. It's the Muse S. So you can look that up, MUSE, and it actually is an EEG headband that you train yourself. So this is neurofeedback and biofeedback that you're able to see on an app how your brain waves are doing. You can wear the headband during sleep, and it shows you which stages of sleep and how long you spent time. And I actually have one. It's very accurate. It's very interesting technology. And then you can kind of do these feedback and sleep audios, and just train your brain how to relax. Really cool stuff. So I'd recommend something like that as well.
Super. Here's another sleep question. Do you have any experience with non-REM sleep disorder? And if so, how do you address it?
So I would have a lot more questions about that, because that can be experienced in so many different ways. So my answer is not really sure. It depends. And so if there's something, so it sounds like this person has gotten maybe a sleep study done and has gotten a proper diagnosis of that. Okay, so acting out dreams. So this is actually common in PTSD. Thank you for that further description. So this is actually very common in PTSD. So whenever we are in REM sleep, we are paralyzed. And that's because we're dreaming wild dreams. And if we weren't paralyzed, we would get out of bed and act out dreams, right? So this can be a danger risk to yourself and your bed partner if you have non-REM sleep disorder. So with this, this is where I would work closely with the medical professional to try to figure out, how to best handle this. But I think working with a partner, and I would always recommend the sleep hygiene, and even getting creative and looking into different foods. There is a lot of evidence that sometimes when our brain does those things, it's a little bit of an allergy or something that we eat. It might be connected. So I would do kind of it's not necessarily a diet, but it's where you really pull back and you only eat certain things and then you add certain things in. I think that would be a wise thing to do. So because I don't work with medications as a psychologist, I'm always thinking behaviorally and cognitively. And something like, food sensitivity might be one of those behavioral things that you may be able to adjust. So that's the angle that I would take. And then I would also work with some anxiety and safety issues that might be tied into that.
That's super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up a little bit early tonight. Dr. Bira, this was wonderful. So much to think and contemplate as we continue this journey of growth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and I'll see you next week.